And one thing further that both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche recognized, and this was no mean feat in their time, was that this crisis was intimately related to the progress of science. They both recognized that. Kierkegaard drew the conclusion from this, and I dealt in detail with this in the first lecture, that science was a bad thing, that science was a dangerous thing, and that one ought to have the courage to be unscientific, that one ought to have the courage to believe what science considers absurd, that one ought to go against reason and against science. Nietzsche's attitude, on the whole, I think, was in favor of science. This is one of the points on which I have tried in my work on Nietzsche to interpret him somewhat differently from the way many other people have interpreted him. I've tried to show in considerable detail that his attitude toward reason was on the whole affirmative, appreciative, and similarly also his attitude toward science. And there are abundant texts to bear this out. And in his criticism of Christianity, he comes back to this theme time and again, that Christianity has been anti-scientific, anti-rational. But although Nietzsche, in important respects, made common cause with science, he did not share, as most of the thinkers of the later 19th century did, the vast optimism about science, as if now that we have science and science grows, it will solve all our problems and people will become more humane and better and everything will be fine. Nietzsche, while affirming science, realized that science did produce crises in religion, in philosophy, and in morality. Moreover, he did not agree with the English-speaking philosophers today who want to make of philosophy an academic specialty modeled on the sciences. Nietzsche did not believe in restricting philosophy to matters on which factual agreement can be obtained. In these respects, he was not at all in favor of emulating science. Here he saw some of the dangers of science. What he was in favor of, and this is a distinction worth making, and a distinction with which I definitely ally myself, what he was in favor of was careful, critical thinking, and even experimental thinking to the extent of being willing to engage in thought experiments, to consider alternative views in morality, in theory of knowledge, wherever philosophers think, to weigh these against each other. There's actually one of Nietzsche's books that has the title Fröhliche Wissenschaft and subtitled Gaia Scienza, and in English should be called The Gay Science, although unfortunately it was translated, very misleadingly I think, as The Joyful Wisdom. What Nietzsche had in mind was gay science, and what he meant by science was this open-minded, critical, experimental spirit. So both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche understood the crisis, understood its connection with science, but took different views of science. Now, briefly, before I turn to Sartre, I want to go on from Kierkegaard and Nietzsche to a couple of existentialists whom I do not propose to discuss in any detail, but of whom at least I want to indicate briefly, as was suggested in the printed announcement of these lectures, how they fit into the picture, at least how I propose to fit them into this picture. There is, first of all, Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher still living, now in his 70s, who is by some people considered the most profound existentialist philosopher. Now, how Heidegger reacts to the modern crisis can be, I think, not unfairly suggested by a sentence that I shall quote from him, and that incidentally is also quoted emphatically and apparently with approval in a recent very popular book on existentialism, where it is also singled out as very characteristic, although the author finds no fault with it. So it's not malice that dictates my picking this particular sentence. The sentence is, thinking does not begin until we learn that reason, though glorified for centuries, is the most stubborn adversary of thinking. This is what Heidegger says. Thinking does not begin until we learn that reason, though glorified for centuries, is the most stubborn adversary of thinking. I think this is very interesting. In this respect, Heidegger, although widely characterized as an atheist, and he doesn't mind this characterization, he certainly is not a theist. I don't like these labels of theist and atheist particularly, but he is certainly avowedly not a theist. In this respect, Heidegger is much closer to Kierkegaard than are such people as, for example, Karl Jaspers and Paul Tillich, who make much more of their respect and admiration for Kierkegaard than Heidegger does. When Heidegger talks of Kierkegaard these days, it's by way of depreciation. He was not a philosopher, he was merely a religious thinker. Leaving out the merely, I agree that Kierkegaard was no philosopher, but a religious writer. He said so himself. But in this anti-scientific, anti-rational bias, this is interesting, I think, Heidegger, though not a Christian and not a theist, is really much closer to Kierkegaard than any number of other contemporary existentialists. Now, what remains if you have this animus against reason, if you recognize, as Heidegger too does, the connection between science and technology and the characteristic feats of the 20th century, if you recognize the connection between that, what is usually considered progress on the one hand, and the crisis in religion, philosophy, and morality on the other hand. Well, he draws the conclusion we must therefore, in some sense, oppose scientific thinking. We must oppose reason. This raises the big question, well, how then is one as a philosopher going to think and write? And what I think almost necessarily has to happen is that a philosopher who adopts this attitude must relapse into a highly arbitrary way of thinking, which will either be associative thinking, just sort of moving from one sentiment to the next one that's associated, almost the way a Freudian patient on the couch does when engaging in free association, or doing something else which really isn't so different, namely, in order to avoid total anarchy and incoherence, to find some texts of which he can then offer exegeses. And in this way, Heidegger seeks his way back to the earliest philosophers, the pre-Socratic philosophers, some of whom wrote poetically, some of whom wrote aphoristically, and all of whom have one thing in common, and that is that we don't possess any of their works, but only scattered quotations, only fragments preserved in the writings of other people. I share with Heidegger an enormously high regard for some of these fragments, which are fascinating, which are worth studying. But I don't think it is an example of sound method to try to develop a philosophy by taking sentences out of context. Usually there is no context. When there is one, Heidegger still takes them out of context. And then, and this is almost inevitable, reading his own ideas into them. This is not just my opinion, but even those followers of Heidegger who greatly admire his earlier work, if they happen to be classical philologists as well, roundly repudiate his interpretations of Greek philosophers as philologically untenable. And people who know their Rilke realize that his Rilke interpretations are untenable, and people who know their Nietzsche realize that his Nietzsche interpretations are untenable. But this is not surprising. This is not just something that happens to happen, but if thinking does not begin until we learn that reason, though glorified for centuries, is the most stubborn adversary of thinking, if we deliberately overrule reason and scientific procedures in the sense of a regard for evidence and impartiality, well then, how can the interpretations be sound? They might in places be enormously suggestive and exciting, but I never can persuade myself that it's very difficult to be suggestive and exciting if one doesn't care to be sound. I'll give you one example, which is both in print and which I also happen to hear in person. Heidegger gave a series of lectures at Freiburg in 1955-56 on what he called der Satz vom Grund, which seemed to mean the principle of reason, the principle of sufficient reason. And the turning point of the lectures was provided by a sentence which I will initially have to give in German, and I trust that some of you will understand it. He began to talk about the leap, one of Kierkegaard's conceptions, L-E-A-P, the jump, the leap. And he said, der Sprung ist der Satz vom Grundsatz vom Grund in das Sagen des Seins. Which means something like, the leap is the jump from the basic principle of reason into saying something about being. But it all depends on punning. Namely, the word Satz, he suddenly pointed out, doesn't only mean sentence or principle, but can also mean in German jump or leap, as when one says, Heidegger's own example, ist mit einem Satz zur Tür hinaus, he is out of the door with one jump. And similarly, Grund can also mean ground, so that suddenly from the principle of reason, we get to the jump from the ground. Now, this is the height of arbitrariness. It is suggestive, but it is terribly close, and for a philosopher, compromisingly close to Finnegan's Wake. This makes it eminently suitable for study in graduate seminars, where you want to discuss something that's difficult and puzzle it out, and something can perhaps be learned from it. But the important thing is that not only is the whole history of philosophy since the pre-Socratics rejected by Heidegger because it attempts to be rational and reasonable, but what we get instead is something that is in its nature completely arbitrary, unsound, and dangerous. That he might, for all that, have occasional insights is another matter. I personally happen to think that he has fewer of those than other existentialists. This may be a minority view, and I shall not try to argue it in detail here. I have dealt, I might say, with Heidegger in some detail, and for that matter also with Jaspers in some detail, in From Shakespeare to Existentialism, which was recently issued in paperback by Anchor Books, in chapters 15, 17, and 18. And there too is a chapter, it happens to be chapter 14, that deals in some detail with the relation of philosophy and poetry, which of course is crucial for doing justice to Heidegger, since what he wants to do is bring philosophy closer to poetry than to science. So I'll refer you here to my From Shakespeare to Existentialism and move on to a few passing remarks about Jaspers and Tillich before moving on to Sartre, with whom I want to deal in some detail. In Jaspers and also in Tillich, who are in many ways, I think, similar, you find attitudes that are avowedly and emphatically in favor of reason and in favor of science. They both on the whole lean over backwards not to share Kierkegaard's anti-scientific bias, but rather to welcome science. Where religion and science conflict, Tillich is likely to say that religion must be in the wrong, and similarly Jaspers insists being himself a doctor of medicine who specialized later in psychiatry, that it is good training for a philosopher to master one of the sciences.